Genetics and ethics, an issue that's been debated for some years and took particularly sharp turn this year with the Genome Project being made public. Today we're going to be looking at that in terms of the religious community, the faith perspective on it on Austin Faith Dialogue. Please join us.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, in behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, bidding you welcome to this edition of the show. And today we're going to be addressing an issue that has gained wide public recognition in recent months, and that is the Genome Project and how that relates to the larger issue of genetics and ethics. And it was earlier this year that there was a conference held by the South Central Conference of the United Church of Christ entitled Genetics, Promise, or Curse. This was a gathering of clergy, of physicians, of persons in the legal and medical professions talking about what is the promise and what is the potential curse of this new research that's being conducted as we have learned about it in recent times. Today, we have participants from that conference. The Reverend James Tomasic, Conference Minister Emeritus of the South Central Conference of the United Church of Christ. We have Olivia White, Assistant Professor of Genetics at the University of North Texas in Denton. And we have Ramby Briggs, a physician at Scott & White Clinic and also Assistant Professor at Texas A&M. We welcome each and every one of you. And I think you've come the farthest to be with us on this program. Olivia from Denton, where you teach in genetics. And I think it'd be helpful for us and our viewers to have you just say what are the developments in genetics and particularly this Genome Project that we've heard so much about.
Well, since the time back in the 1800s when Mendel first talked about the principle of inheritance, we have come a long ways. We know that the DNA is the molecule that contains the genetic material. But more recently, this June, that when the project was completed, the big announcement was made. And Human Genome Project is the project that completed all of the mapping and sequences of the total genetic makeup of human being.
All right. Now that we've heard this term mapping, that you mean we know like all the genes that make up a given human being? Is that what that means?
All of the genes as to where they are located on the chromosomes and what is the sequence, what is they are going to be doing, and that sequencing is the one that has just been completed.
All right. Okay, now I think that, Ramby, you're a practicing physician.
Yes.
And do you see that this has promise, will have or already has promise for your practice?
Well, certainly. Well, for my practice, I may not be here long enough to see that. But I think within the lifetime of many of the physicians that we see now, and the young physicians, yes, and the people that are young. But this is the Genome Project is only a very small part of intensive study on inherited patterns of who we are and what we are that have been taking place for the last 50 or 100 years. And this is just another phase of a long continuum of progressing information, which has already had great impact on how we practice medicine and on people's health, but it has much more promise for the future.
Give us an example of the promise that it has or will have.
Right. We were discussing, in a way to make it more concrete, we could talk about one condition.
All right.
Just in an effort to make it personal and to objectify it. There's a condition called familial adenomatous polyps of the colon. It's what we call autosomal dominant disease, which means that if one parent can pass this gene, the child will express the gene. And in this condition, if the child receives the gene, it's almost 100%, it is 100% that the child will develop cancer of the colon.
Okay.
Now we can identify those people prenatally. We can identify them before they develop the polyps, before they develop the condition.
Mm-hmm.
We can do preventative surgery. We don't need the genetic pattern to know that. They can save these people's lives. Maybe in the future we can prevent the children from having the condition.
Okay.
That's kind of where it's going.
That's the direction. Okay. Jim, as I listen to this, what's the ethical issue involved with just genetic research?
The ethical issue, as I see it anyway, and as the colloquium which gathered saw, how responsible are we when we look at the genetic code, and how is it appropriated for persons, particularly those who would benefit if they have a disease or an illness that can be predicted this way. But how is it fair, how is it kept fair for all folk to participate in? If it's a public project, it has more of a tendency to be protected. If it's a commercial project, then it only is dictated by who can afford it. And I think that's the primary issue. How do we keep the whole study of genetic engineering fair for all participation, for all to participate?
Okay, so it's the availability of the research, of the discoveries to all people rather than just to a few that can afford it?
That is correct. That I think is a primary ethical issue. There are others. You know, we in the religious world think that God is sovereign and to be involved, but we are not critical of science development. We think that scientists and the science product can be revelatory in life as well.
But aren't there some people that say that it's going against the Creator to be manipulating these genes?
Well, I presume there would always be those who might take an opposite view, yes. I know they are critical of it. That is that we are manipulating God's plan.
Yeah.
We are partners in God's plan from our point of view. We have brains, intelligent. We are to use that in ways that are helpful and productive in our time. And I think we can see ourselves as participants in the creation. We've not been very good at it. That is, in terms of the creation, we've utilized it pretty.
Okay. We've misused it, in other words, as well.
Misused, yes.
All right. You're assistant professor of genetics at North Texas University there. But you're also a person of faith.
Right.
What do you see as the issue from a faith perspective?
Well, one of the issues that I see from faith perspective, I see there are a lot of advantages of these kind of research, because what genetics is going to do in the new technology, you can screen people ahead of time, you can find treatment, cure, and management. For the state of Texas, we ought to know that every child that's born in the hospital in the state of Texas is screened for PKU, phenylketonuria. It's a genetic disorder, and this is a disorder that causes mental retardation. If we screen a baby at the time of the birth, we can give them a special kind of a diet and prevent that mental retardation to take place. And not only in the state of Texas, but all 50 states test for it. But the question that Jim is raising is very fair, that we do not screen for all the disease, we do not test for all of the disease. Human Genome Project promises that eventually we will be able to screen, we might be able to have a test available or treatment available. And the question again comes in, the fairness question. Is it going to be available to all of the people?
Okay. Do you see any ethical issues besides the ones that have been named, Rambi, in terms of, from your faith point of view?
Well, of course, and I think to raise it up once more, is going to be access to the talents. I mean, we're in a world that we can't even have food for everybody. So how can we apply genetic engineering equally and equitably
And there are 45 million people without health insurance.
Exactly. And our state at least ranks among the best in that regard, or the worst, depending on how you would like to look at it.
Right.
So we have so many mountains to get over in that regard, and that is a very key issue. I don't see very many people, well, there's just almost no evidence that people are looking at this information from a negative or a mean or a cruel, manipulative way. We do have concerns about information about private individuals and how that information will be used, but that's a whole area.
Well,
of
what is the
major concern.
privacy issue?
Well, the main privacy issue is that, as Olivia was saying, it is quite conceivable in the future, and maybe not too distant future, that a child could be mapped almost at birth. We could know if this child is going to have certain one of the inherited malignancies, going to have a disease like cystic fibrosis, going to have breast cancer, going to become demented at midlife from Huntington's chorea. These things we can know. Well, then is society, are we going to let that information be used to map that child's life? That is one way that I think that we would have to, as a society, make some very clear rules and laws to protect each other from that kind of information.
There are no laws now to protect people's privacy in that regard?
Well, Jim can express that better. He was telling us about how the Constitution as a whole, was it Justice Douglas? Please.
Yes.
Yes.
We've got a minute or
You
two
said
before
it
the
so
break
well.
here.
I
Just
would like for you to
summarize
say-
the whole legal field here
that's
just in a
important,
minute.
though.
There is a guarantee for privacy in the Constitution of the United States. There was a bill passed in '74, tested by the courts. Justice Douglas said it's inherent in the Constitution, but there are no specific rules guaranteeing privacy. We would like to see a constitutional amendment that included that. It just would make things easier for us to enforce.
Because if it's discovered that someone has this condition, then that could be used against them over a period of time.
To limit their life,
Yeah.
you know, and
Insurance or
Getting
whatever.
Whatever.
insurance, getting
That's right.
employment. All right.
Okay. Well, I tell you one thing about limits is time on this program. We have to take a break right here in the middle, but we'll be back in just a minute, folks, with this continued discussion about genetics and ethics, and we've just begun to explore it, so be sure and come back and join us for the second half. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today we are probing the issue of genetics and ethics. We've been pleased to welcome in the first half those who are still with us in the second half. The Reverend James Tomasic, Conference Minister Emeritus of the Southern Central Conference of the United Church of Christ. Olivia White, Assistant Professor of Genetics at the University of North Texas, is in Denton, and Ramby Briggs, physician at Scott and White Clinic and assistant professor at Texas A&M. In the first half, folks, we were beginning to talk about the promise as well as the potential curse of genetics. You know, speaking of curse, isn't it the case that when Hitler used, people for mental purposes, and I don't know if it was genetic manipulation that was going on, but that's sometimes used as a case study of how science can be turned against human life and values. Are we under any kind of threat of that? Olivia, have you heard that sort of thing used?
Yes, I have heard a lot of concerns that have been made, but one of the things with the genetic research is that there are very strict rules and regulations, so things that have been done, and if when genetic engineering is done and a product is produced, they go through a lot of testing before it is released out for the consumption of the people. Now, there are ways you can test it, but some of the time that you cannot look for the long-term effect, but you can look at the short-term effect. So for example, there are good research that have been done with Green Revolution, creating a quality of wheat that's very good and it's a lot of nutrition. Same thing that we had done, a genetically engineered corn. Now we are beginning to find out the long-term effect that if the pollen is consumed by the butterfly, the monarch butterfly population is going down. Now that's very long term. So we need to balance that in terms of the checks. So yes, we really very long term effect we may not know.
Can I summarize what I think I heard you say? That there are checks and balances worked into this
Yes.
research and this practice. Now you mentioned corn, and that makes me think of Texas A&M. You teach as assistant professor there. This is done with plants, and then it's now being done with humans as well. Is that what you're discovering in your work?
Well, yes, it's such a broad area that to focus in on one issue is very difficult, but there's no question that we can make food that can be more productive, that can be healthy, and we can also disturb the balance of nature with these issues. But we disturb the balance of nature with every other issue, from taking water out of the Colorado to what we do with our corn pollen to the flies that used to infect our cattle that don't anymore. There's just so many issues that every time we unleash, what was that wonderful weed they brought to this country called Johnson grass? Johnson grass is not native to Texas, but every poor man field in this country is out there chopping up the Johnson grass, you know? So who let that rascal loose? And I think the analogy is very apropos.
Really?
Yes.
The
I think
kudzu in
the
Alabama
kudzu in
and
North
Georgia.
Carolina, that's right.
Yeah.
You know, the nutria in our bays in Texas, everything we do disturbs the balance, and there are implications, and we have to be very alert.
Okay, now here's the theologian. I'm going to ask you the question here about, there are people in the religious community that say it's against God's will to, manipulate, if they're trying to determine the gender of the baby that you want to have, or manipulate the genes in some way to affect an outcome that's not natural. Theologian, what do you say to that?
Well, defining what's natural and what's not natural is a very difficult issue, but what I see is that we are intelligent persons. We can use our minds. We are in co-creation with God. That's the way that I would posture it, and that we need to be responsible stewards of the gifts that we are given and use them wisely. We know that we don't do it. Yes, I can see that we could manipulate against God, as we can choose either to be for or against in any ethical decision. But I think that we are called to be responsible stewards of the life that we're given, and we do not oppose, or at least in my understanding of the Christian faith, we do not oppose using our minds to develop new technologies.
Okay, now this conference that you had leadership in on earlier in the year about genetics as promise or curse, and you had these 24 people, the law people, the theological people, the medical people, and so on. You came out with some kind of a statement, some kind of a resolution. What was the gist of that?
The gist of that resolution was to alert the churches and the membership of the United Church of Christ in this area to the issue, and to reclaim that we do believe in a sovereign God, but we also believe in a sacred creation, and that we are part of that. And we also indicated that the scientist needs to be responsible with regard to some of the ethical issues that we pointed to. And we also took a resolution to amend the Constitution of the United States, rather arrogant of us, I guess, but we're trying to pass it on to our denomination that it might get some effect, that privacy be guaranteed in the Constitution of the United States.
Okay, that's what we were touching on earlier then.
Right.
Okay, were either of you at that conference?
Yes.
You were
Yes,
both
sir.
there. Okay. Did you take something away from you that is helpful to you in your practice as a geneticist?
Well, I was in one of the leadership role,
Okay.
and I explained to the group what genetics is all about. So I was one of the resource person
All right.
talking about what genetics is. It was interesting that the group, that these lawyers and the physicians and theologians, how receptive they were to receive the information, try to understand, because in order for them to deal with the issues, they needed to know something as to what this technology is and what the Human Genome Project is all about. So it gave them some background, and that's what I was there to present to them as a person of faith myself, since I belong to the South Central Conference, to giving the perspective on that basis.
I see. And you were there too.
Yes.
Were you glad you went?
Oh, yes.
And what did you bring?
Well, I think quite a bit what Dr. White said, which is that there was a feeling of enthusiasm for a lot of folks that knew very little about genetics, but were trained professionals and were quick to come to questions and concerns that I think that the public as a whole will consider to be valid concerns. And I think that's why we focused on the privacy issue so quickly, because the technology and the science is very exciting. And the possibilities are exciting.
And isn't it the case that technology is moving so fast that it gets way out ahead of where the law is? Or where?
Think so, yes.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I noticed, that experienced, is that people realize that genetics is not for scientists out there, but genetics and genes, it's all of us. It's part of who we are. It's the
Yes.
chemical nature. So we need to be concerned about it. And we realize that it's important that in the church that we have resources available where people can know and deal with this and talk about these issues. And in terms of the lawyers, when we talked about the technology is moving so fast that the legal system have not kept up with the technology. So we still need to have laws in place to protect our privacy, to have the issue of fairness, and to have the rules and regulation so misuse cannot take place.
I want to talk about single cell or single gene disease. We mentioned that earlier on, and that's the thing that it seems to me that people looking in could identify with as a potential here. What are some of the various diseases, single cell or single
gene
Yeah.
disorder. One of the misconception of people, that they think that any disease you have is caused by gene, or
Right.
gene has gone bad. But we need to know that there are genetic disorders and there are non-genetic disorders. Within genetic disorder, there are certain disorders that are caused by misfunctioning of a single gene, and we call that a single gene. Now, those are easy to identify, easy to screen, and easy to treat for. But then there are many diseases that are multiple gene disorder. And so we hear of the term, we talk about disposition, that you have a disposition for breast cancer. There are multiple genes and environment all involved.
So breast
that is
cancer would...
No.
But what would be some others?
Cystic fibrosis is one
Okay.
disorder very prevalent among individuals that are European background. Sickle cell anemia among African American, Tay-Sachs disease among Jewish people, Huntington's chorea,
Okay.
and these are some of the common disorders that you hear about.
Okay. Dr. Briggs, you identify these single gene disorders. Maybe as someone is born or early in life, then can you potentially manipulate those genes to offset that so that the person doesn't come into the world with it or can be remedied of it as they're born? Is that a potential vision of where we're going?
Yes, very realistically, and we're getting there with some diseases, but we're not very far along that path. But that doesn't mean there aren't things we can't do about it. For example, if we can identify a child with Huntington's chorea at birth, if it's determined that this child will be born,
All right.
that child will probably right now will have Huntington's chorea. We
Okay.
can't turn that around. However, that child does not have to give birth to more children. That child does not have to sire more children.
Because you can remove that gene?
No, he could choose not to sire children right now.
Oh, I see.
You know, that's right. You know, so you can say, okay, I will not reproduce
Okay.
myself because I carry the
All right,
potentially
all right.
lethal gene.
So that could-
There are options other than manipulating the gene, and so that we can't always have our cake and eat it, though, in
Okay.
this situation.
Now, I've been waiting for the blockbuster question for Reverend Tomasi.
Yes.
Hey, it was this article in the Austin American-Statesman. It was, I'm not sure it was local, but it was featured here. It was the headline was, "Is there a gene for the soul?"
Well, God probably only knows for sure if there's a gene for the soul. I think we all have souls,
Yes.
but I'm not predicting genes.
You wouldn't say that's a single gene phenomenon, the soul.
I wouldn't.
So.
I don't think so.
And that leads me to a final comment. I think the genius of this particular colloquium was that it was a cross-discipline experience where lawyers and doctors and people of theology spoke together. And that very seldom happens, and I think that's one of the creative things that happened with us. Many lives were affected by that.
Okay. Well, I think going back to the sort of the theological as distinct from the ethical issue, you've got this discoveries about how much we are determined by our genetic makeup, and yet to try to reduce human life to that is we have less than a minute. Would you say that we can reduce the soul to this pattern of chemistry and genetics?
I don't think that we can reduce the soul. We can simply work towards improving the gene and the quality of life, the physical part of it. But in terms of spiritual life, behavior, that is controlled by many other factors besides the genes.
Okay. And another thing that is controlled by many other factors is the length of this program, which we're about to conclude after a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for being here. Randy Briggs, bless you in your work. And thank you for coming from Denton, Olivia White. And Dr. Tomasic, bless you as always for being so creative in our community. And thank you folks for looking. I'm Richard Thompson on behalf of AMM. Join us again next week.